Welcome and thank you for attending this morning. And we have a most esteemed panel to begin with this morning, and I will introduce them. I ask that you hold your applause until I've introduced everyone, and our fourth speaker is en route, so I'm going to give you his bio as well. But let me start with Dr. Elaina Quintana, who is the Executive Director. Dr. Quintana, immediately to my left, is the Executive Director of the Institute on Public Safety and Social Justice at the Adler School of Professional Psychology. She was trained in both clinical and community psychology at DePaul University and currently works in the area of creating programs, conducting research, and promoting events dealing with socially just solutions to public safety problems. Some of these projects include working to reduce trauma and youth criminalization while enhancing community structures to support those most likely to become court involved. Next to Dr. Quintana is Betsy Clarke, who is founder and president of the Juvenile Justice Initiative, a statewide advocacy organization which promotes fair, rational, and effective juvenile justice policies in Illinois. If you want to know anything about juvenile justice from a legislative or policy standpoint, Ms. Clarke is the person to see. She has served as a juvenile justice counsel for the Office of the Public Defender here in Cook County, served for 15 years in the Office of the State Appellate Defender, is an author of numerous articles and a recipient of many awards. Next to Ms. Clarke is Xavier McElrath-Bey, who is a youth justice advocate with the Campaign for Fair Sentencing of Youth, a national coalition and clearinghouse that coordinates, develops, and supports efforts to implement age-appropriate alternatives to the extreme sentencing of America's youth. And I hope Xavier would allow me the personal privilege of saying his life story is a compelling one because he was arrested at age 13, charged and convicted to a sentence of 25 years, served 13 years of that time, came out armed with a bachelor's degree, and has gone on to lead an exemplary life. Our fourth presenter, who should be here shortly, I hope, is Mr. Daryle Brown, who is the Director of Multimedia and Communications for Trinity United Church of Christ. And in addition to his professional work in that area, he is the director of the Next Movement Project, which stems from a dialogue with Michelle Alexander, the author of The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, and the project which stemmed, or the work which stemmed from that book. And he formed Next Movement as an open interfaith community of the Trinity United Church prison ministry to begin to, as he puts it, evangelize, organize, and strategize around the issue to end mass incarceration in America. So please welcome all of our panelists this morning. I'm not going to talk at length other than to say I think what we're here to really talk about this morning is connecting the dots. Why are youth so angry? Why is there violence? What are the dots that we can connect in terms of identifying the sources of youth violence? And as a commentator speaking about the city of Milwaukee recently said, we have an opportunity to connect the dots on the community's youth violence and maybe start to do something meaningful about it. We know as a first matter that shootings are rampant, that kids become accustomed to the violence, and it becomes akin to a car backfiring. It becomes so routinized in their life. The second dot is that schools, the violence in schools, and the fact that schools, which should be a safe haven, have often also become a source of violence. And the third dot, the particular dot with respect to young black men and black boys, why are they so likely to be expelled, to have school become a pipeway to the prison system? Why do these things happen? And so we, all of us in our respective roles, have to deal with the hurt that our youth have experienced? How do we stop rejecting? How do we stop sentencing? How do we start embracing? These are the questions that we have to ask. Dr. Quintana.
Thanks. I'm really happy to be here. And I've spent a long time talking a lot about trauma generally, but I really want to do most of my focus around what it takes to heal and address some of the issues that we hear a lot. I spent 12 years working at Ceasefire, so I thought a lot in that time around violence and violence prevention. When I think about lots of the issues that come up that many young people face, not just people who are victims or perpetrators of violence, but lots of people, that they have a common origin within trauma. And so we hear this phrase sometimes, hurt people, and I think that's true. But what we do about it is just hurting them more. So I'm working toward a paradigm shift here, right? What we end up doing, like, I want you to think of a piece of fabric, and I want you to think about, have you ever gotten a sweater and it snagged, and then like a piece of the yarn fell out or something, and then you can't really wear the sweater anymore because it's got a big hole in it? That's what we do to our communities all the time when we take kids out and we start locking them up. We're not protecting the integrity of the fabric, right? So we use suppression, isolation, shame, denial of access to education, and negative, treatment of these people, and they only serve to make problems worse, right? And if we really want to improve public safety, if we want to help people become more functional members of society, we need a different approach that really does understand trauma and involves families in a non-judgmental way. So this is the ACEs study. I know the ACEs has gotten a lot of play recently, and I don't know how many people have heard about the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. I'm going to cover it very briefly. Two doctors, Ando and Floody, did a longitudinal study where they talked to lots and lots of people in San Diego, and what they found when they asked about 10 questions, either 5 kinds of abuse and neglect, so psychological, sexual, or physical abuse, and then emotional and physical neglect, and then 5 kinds of household dysfunction, including substance abuse, loss of a biological parent for any reason by age 18, being brought up by somebody who is mentally ill or chronically depressed, watching your mother or mother figure treated violently, or having a household member go to prison. And what they found is that in a mostly middle-class San Diego, mostly white, college-educated population, that each of these things was incredibly common. And you can imagine that in lots of neighborhoods, particularly that are a target of mass incarceration, that imprisoned household members are really a lot higher figure, right? And these things end up occurring in clusters, right? And so 2/3 of us experience at least one adverse childhood experience. They've now collected data in 21 states. They started collecting in Illinois last year. If any one adverse childhood experience is present, there's an 87% chance that another one will be present, and a 50% chance that there will be 3 or more. That's important because the more ACEs you have, the more health disparities you experience. And that's shown in these charts, where you can see, just for example, that mental health, like missing days of work or feeling unhealthy, you're much more likely to miss work, like 4 times more likely if you have high ACEs than if you have low, to miss work, to get treatment for a mental health condition, or to require special equipment. There's also other things that are not mental health related that you wouldn't even connect to adverse childhood experiences. Like, if you've had very high adverse childhood experiences, your chances of being a current smoker are about 3 times higher than if you've had low adverse childhood experiences. They're about twice as high to have diabetes. You have twice as high of a chance of having diabetes if you have high ACEs than if you have low. About twice as high of an incidence of cardiovascular disease if you have high ACEs than if you have low. And you're 5 times more likely to contract HIV if you have high ACEs than if you have low. So you can see these very startling health disparities. And this is their conceptual model, just to take you through it. Everybody's born, I actually added the historical trauma, and I want to talk about that for a minute. But everybody is born into a context. So I talk about that as a historical context. You might experience bad things in childhood, which create social, emotional, cognitive adjustments to be able to survive in your situation. And because people don't want to have cognitive impairments, they seek ways of coping with these. And so you can think of adopting health risk behaviors that are common. Very common ones are, smoking, drinking, overeating, gambling. All of these things create different kinds of chemicals within your brain that try to balance out discomfort or the feeling that there is impairment in your brain, right? And then these adoptions of health risk behaviors then lead to disease, disability, and social problems, which then lead to early death. So people with 6 ACEs or higher die on average 20 years sooner than people with 0. So all this sounds like the bad news, and it is bad news, but it's important to know what's happening, right? I think there's also an aspect of trauma that people do not think about. It's at the bottom of the pyramid, and it's called historical trauma. And so examples of historical trauma include things like loss of a homeland or your way of life, being able to raise your children, speak your language, practice your religion. I mean, there's lots of ways that people have suffered, generations of people have suffered, like, when the steel mills closed down. That is a historical trauma to a way of life. You can think of Native American genocide. There's lots of them that we can think of, but these insults, these kind of generational insults, lead to grief that's unresolved and unspoken, internalized depression, and increased cortisol levels that contribute to lots of these health disparities that we're seeing here. So this is a definition. Historical trauma is actually a term that was created by a Native American scholar, and her definition is on the top: the collective emotional and psychological injury, both over the lifespan and across generations, resulting from cataclysmic history that occurs as a result of genocide and other significant abuses. I have added to this. And it's at the bottom that basically there needs to be continues a legacy of systematic marginalization through current enforcement of policies, practices, and laws that recreate trauma. I think it's really important to understand that history and those historical insults are huge, but the thing that makes it last over time are the continued disparities or inaccess to justice, right? So I think I have a good example right there, right, on the slide. But I want to give an example. A lot of people don't know this, but one of the civilizations that had the longest reign of slavery was Scotland and Ireland. And their ancestors, the Albas and the Picts, they sold their people into slavery forever, in lots of different places. And in fact, at the same time the Africans were being brought over and enslaved, so were Scots and Irish people and other white people from other places that were put on boats and sent over to the U.S. However, in the U.S., the legacy of slavery is seen almost totally as an African American experience. And, I think that this is very interesting because it shows that those, the kind of effects from that incredibly horrible insult of hundreds of years can be healed and can be reversed. Certainly, Irish and Scottish people have access to lots of things in this society and are not getting, are not disproportionately arrested, and a million other, don't have higher blood pressure, all this stuff, based on their 1,000-year history of slavery. So I'm suggesting here that when we afford access to opportunity and justice, that real healing can occur. And I have an example. Did I change it? Something happened. Okay, so here's my example. With same-sex marriage, what's really interesting, there's this guy, I think it's Hatzenbuehler, who was working as an intern at a Massachusetts mental health clinic in 2004. And he was studying depression among what he called sexual minority males, so gay, bisexual, transgender. And what happened in the middle, which he did not plan on, was that gay marriage was ratified in the state of Massachusetts. And what was incredible was that he found that there was a large, like a statistically significant decrease in medical care visits, mental health care costs in this population from when you compare the 12 months before marriage became legal to the 12 months after, which suggests that equality, when we stop marginalizing people, that it actually helps breed wellness. My clicker? Oh, yeah, okay. I think that when there's lots of disparity between people who have privilege and people who don't, that people have privilege, they assume that others have the same access to justice or the same access to opportunity that they do. And the problem is, this false assumption leads to characterize people negatively, like it's a personal problem or it's a problem with XYZ community, or they don't know how to do things, and I was poor too when I grew up, or whatever, right? And so we end up personalizing what are really larger systemic issues. So we've heard this a lot. I'm sorry, my screen is going crazy here. It's showing two different slides at the same time, so I want to make sure you guys have the right thing. But we've heard this phrase always. Anybody involved in criminal justice has heard the term personal responsibility. What about personal responsibility? People have to be responsible for their actions. And to a certain extent, it's true. People should be responsible for their actions. I think the larger issue is that we use this term to justify very harsh sentencing that doesn't really, in the long run, help people transform themselves to actually be responsible for their actions, right? And so we all, as members of this society, and as adults who are working with kids, have a responsibility to recognize the way in which the systems that we ourselves create or maintain, like the schools or the criminal justice systems, are actually recreating rather than addressing trauma. And this is a serious issue because all of these things like trauma exposure, including ACEs, resilience factors, genetics, things like nutrition or exposure to historical trauma, all these things really vastly affect our perception, cognitive ability and functioning, our reactions and interactions of our brains, right? So what we put into our brains and the experiences that we go through, our brain's just trying to help us survive, right? So when you see whole groups of people that are like having a really hard time and are becoming violent and discontented, something systemic is going on. It's not an individual issue, it's a systemic issue. Let me talk about this a little bit because I think it's important, is that there's a 911 center, it's like a little almond that looks, it's called the amygdala, and the amygdala is a 911 center in your brain. It basically tells you, 911, something's happening, right? You're about to get hit by a car, right? Say you're walking across the street, cars come down the street, you jump a little bit because you think the car doesn't see you, right? And then all of a sudden the car stops and then you're able to calm down, can proceed across the street and be like, whoo, that was a close one, right? For people who have lots of trauma, what happens is the amygdala goes off and is like, 911, you're about to get hit by a car. And then it goes through the hippocampus, which is up there as memory lane, right? And that feeling of fear and threat is so big for people who have been through a lot of fear and threat in their lives that basically it goes through the hippocampus, which keeps telling them, you're not safe, you're not safe, you're not safe. That car is still coming at you. It might keep going. It maybe isn't stopping. And then it goes in this loop that is incredibly frightening and that makes people who have experienced lots and lots of trauma very quick to get really upset and very slow to soothe, right? And so then the impulses can never get to the prefrontal cortex, which is the center of reasoning within the brain, which basically tells you, the car's slowing down. You're going to be okay. Keep walking. They didn't mean it. They see you now. Like, you can't even access those thoughts. So when you see people that really get overstimulated by beating on the car and that sort of thing, the question is, what happened to you? What happened to you? Not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. So I want to talk very briefly about there's a big list of resilience factors that are great for kids, and all of these things are pretty intuitive. If you look at them, you think, yeah, kids growing up with good school systems and great families, they're going to have a leg up in this world, and that's right. But lots of people aren't afforded access to like the best care and the best schooling and all those types of things. And so I like to boil it down to really 3 major factors that I think are very, very important and that we can all influence in people's lives. First of all, it's important as people in this world, responsible people in this world, to be able to be sensitive, as I'm describing it, to what trauma causes. So when I talk about how the brain is affected, it's important to perceive what's really going on and kind of help people through it. Here's how to help people through it. Number 1, people who've been traumatized need a trustworthy person they can talk to about their true situation and feelings, because lots of times they just don't have any trustworthy person they can turn to. I like the music. The second is...
We'll have to hold Judge Sumner in contempt.
It's okay. It's got a beat. You can dance to it. So the second one is that it's really important to have the ability to reframe your life, because as kids, what happens with your brain is that even as you grow up, you still blame yourself for what happened. If we were walking down the street and we saw somebody like just beating the tar out of their kid, you'd be like, what's going on, right? Why are you doing that? That's horrible. But as a kid, if that happened to us, as adults, we'd think back and say, oh, I was really hard-headed, I wasn't, I deserved it somehow. And so what's interesting is our child brain doesn't develop as we become older, and so we need to intentionally reframe trauma that we've been through ourselves to kind of say, I wasn't responsible for the fact that I was sexually abused. I wasn't responsible for the fact that my parent was a substance abuser or went to prison or whatever. And this helps people have hope for their future, which is essential to healing. There's other resilience factors, too, that I think are very important. But I want to say a little bit about, how many minutes do I have?
Couple.
Okay, about healing communities. What creates real healing communities? Positive connection, a sense of interreliance, that we never do anything alone. And the more we can connect kids to transactional and functional relationships with caring adults, the more likely they'll be able to have hope and have optimism for their future and actually succeed. Teach kids healthy boundaries, emotional safety, a focus on healing and well-being, rhythm and ritual, inclusion. One of the things on the other one is also positive touch. There's a world of, one thing that's been really harmed in people who've been through a lot of violence is that touch is either sexualized or it's seen as a threat. And there's a world of positive touch, a pat on the back, high five, fist bump, like all those things that are so important to just encouraging people and connecting with people, and I think that's important. These are some great things that are happening in South Chicago, parent cafes. I've been working a lot with restorative justice. Restorative justice is about transforming people to their highest form of functioning within community, and it's a philosophy and a collection of practices that emphasizes the need to repair harm done to individuals and communities. I also think of it as what you just want for your own child. You want them to be accountable, but you also want them to stay in community and to prosper, right? There's lots of great examples of RJ in schools and communities. We need to really get rid of zero tolerance policies because they're not transformative in a good way. We need peace rooms, not police rooms, peer conferencing, restorative chats, peace circles, restorative justice hubs, and we want people to be able to transform. Restorative justice is often seen as something that's really bush league, like, okay, if somebody throws a ball through my window, I can sit down with them, they can cut my lawn for 3 weeks, and then we're even. That's cool for restorative justice, but some of the uses of restorative justice where there's the greatest satisfaction have been in some of the most serious cases. The 20-year anniversary of the genocide in Rwanda just passed. The New York Times did a beautiful photo essay called Portraits of Reconciliation, and this is a woman who says, "He killed my father and 3 brothers. He did these killings with other people, but he came alone to me and asked for pardon. He and a group of other offenders who had been in prison helped me build a house with a covered roof. I was afraid of him, but now I have granted him pardon. Things have become normal, and in my mind, I feel clear." So he had quotes too, and I would Google it right away. It's such a great photo essay for people who haven't seen it. But you can see the power of keeping community together even when it feels like it's irrevocably harmed. There's actual strength in rebuilding and reconnecting as people. Sandra Bloom has a great thing called Sanctuary Model. She has these 7 commitments. And there's also this thing called the Self Model for people who've been through lots and lots of trauma, that they really focus on creating a sense of safety, future, discussions about loss and emotions that really help in Philadelphia gunshot wound victims to restart their lives. So these are some great examples that you can look up and learn more about that really heal community, because we don't heal alone, we heal in community. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaina. And if I can call on Betsy Clarke.
Good morning. Okay, thank you. I would love to open with a song, but I come from a family that can't carry a tune. And when we all used to sit together in church, it was really scary. All right. And let me say that I've been working in the juvenile justice field for over 30 years. And recently, I'm just feeling this increasing sense of urgency to do something. And I have been struggling with what to say to you today because of that. About 2 weeks ago, the National Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights met here in Chicago. They're holding listening sessions around the country on mass incarceration. They got a call from Michelle Alexander, the author of The New Jim Crow, and she said, please, do something, do something. And so they've held a listening session in New York, in Chicago, in LA, and they're going to Atlanta, and they're going to issue a report out of that. The imperative to do something, because discussion has been going on throughout the years that I've been practicing. And Judge Walker, you talked about 20 years. Well, in the course of my very busy week this week, I came across putting together another presentation, Blueprint for the Future, Final Report of Trends and Issues for the 1990s, an Illinois Criminal Justice Forum. This was issued in January of 1991, and in the middle of it, it says, the charge of racism. One of the most troubling issues to emerge from the forum was the charge by some participants of consistent and institutional racism within Illinois' criminal justice system. There's a quote here from Randolph Stone, who was then the Cook County Public Defender. The facts speak for themselves. Black males make up 4% of the population of the state of Illinois, but 60% of the jail and prison population. And in his keynote address to the forum, U.S. District Court Judge James Zagel predicted that the fight against crime would be a catalyst for greater racial unity and tolerance in the 1990s. If his prediction is to come true, this concludes the charge of racial bias within the criminal justice system must be addressed quickly and forcefully. We have not addressed that charge. We have not addressed that charge at all. In fact, I don't know if any of you have been through the detention center recently. The detention center, according to its budget briefing book for FY14, is 98% children of color, the detention center in Cook County. So we have grown worse. We have not grown better. And while I'm not happy, that's the wrong word. The juvenile system has not increased the number of children that we're incarcerating over these last 30 to 40 years. There's been a great deal of work and attention on public policy, fiscal realignment, redeploy Illinois, detention alternatives, and the numbers have gone down, not up as a result. But of course, our adult prison situation, which includes emerging adults, these are still children, 18, 19, 20. I'm the mother of a 20-year-old. She's very much still a child, in my mind at least, has grown astronomically. And from 7,000 when I started practicing law to over 40,000 today in our state corrections system. And I don't know if any of you listened to the House debates on the correctional budget and the budget for DJJ this past week, but it was an abysmal debate. There was no debate about the policy choices that we're making at all. There was just, well. And so hope came very recently, and that is the growth of incarceration in the United States. This is a report out of the National Academy of Sciences. This is a remarkable report because it calls for an end to mass incarceration in this country. And this is something that we should all, within the justice system, be familiar with, we should embrace, and we should take to heart their recommendations because they call for us to dismantle this system of mandatory minimums, this system of lengthy sentences, this system that is unprecedented in human history, the mass incarceration system that we have today. And they point out that there are really 4 principles that we should be following when we set up a justice system. And those 4 principles are proportionality, that sentences must be proportionate to the underlying offense, parsimony, that they must be effective, let me turn to the page, and that the parsimony, that the criminal sanction imposed for an offense should be sufficient but not greater than the punishment necessary to achieve sentencing goals. Citizenship. This is not something that we talk about in court when sentences are imposed, but a key principle of imposing any sentence on a juvenile or an adult is restoring that person to citizenship, full citizenship. And what they say here is the notion that the consequences of a prison sentence should not be so severe as to substantially weaken one's status as a member of society. And this is tested by conditions of confinement that can be considered inhumane. And we recently closed TAMS in this state. I mean, how could we have a facility so inhumane that we would keep people in solitary confinement for decades, not just days, or at all? And finally, the 4th principle is social justice, that prisons should promote, not diminish, a fair distribution of resources, rights, and opportunities. And this is strained when incarceration becomes pervasive in poor and minority communities. This book talks about the consequences of incarceration on communities, the consequences of incarceration on the children of those who are incarcerated, the huge costs that we are paying, not just in dollars, but the moral cost in the fabric of our society with this terrible system of mass incarceration. And I really commend it to your review. Now, on the juvenile side, I want to say, first of all, I run a and have the great honor to run the Juvenile Justice Initiative. You can find this online at jjustice.org, and we are an organization set up to promote progressive policies. Non-governmental, take no governmental funds, to promote progressive policies in Illinois. And one of the things that always strikes me, because I pick up the paper every day and the, shootings are horrible and violent crime is terrible, but you start to think that that's all that's going on in our communities. In the front, we had a one-pager, and I hope that you were able to pick this up on your way in. It will be there on your way out if you didn't. A one-pager on juvenile arrests in Illinois, and this is from 2012. And in fact, throughout the state of Illinois, throughout the county of Cook, throughout Chicago, and in the highest crime areas in Chicago, more than 60% of juvenile arrests are misdemeanor arrests. These are misdemeanor arrests, and we have a choice as a society what to do with these misdemeanor arrests. We can divert them. We can use restorative justice practices, and we have some restorative justice, some of the leaders of the creation of our vibrant restorative justice community here in the audience, Robert Spicer and Cheryl Graves. Or we can put them into the court process. We can send their fingerprints down to the state police. We can diminish with that one act of sending their fingerprints down to the state police their life outcomes for good. And right now there is, just to give you an example, the kind of struggle that you have. More than 60% of the juvenile arrests are misdemeanors, 20% felonies, and less than 2% are Class X and murder of all the juvenile arrests. So let's not forget that most of our children do not get into serious trouble. And in fact, many, many, many of our children, the majority, lead wonderful lives, and we should celebrate that. But with these misdemeanor arrests, we have a choice under state law to send those fingerprints to the state police or not. And there's a bill, Senate Bill 978 in the legislature, and that was promoted by the mayor to automatically expunge those fingerprints when they go to the state police. I respectfully suggest we should not be sending them to the state police, period. This shouldn't be a question of automatically expunging. We should not be sending them. And to give you a sense of the struggle and the pushback, and God bless Senator Raul, who has kept up an incredible battle in Springfield for many years. But the pushback now is that House Amendment 1, if you look online at ilga.gov, was filed at the end of this week, and that would allow law enforcement, including prosecutors, to object to the automatic expungement of arrests that never go to court, at the age of 18. Now, of course, it guts the bill. It completely guts the bill. So this is the struggle. This is the struggle that we're engaged in today. You ask why our children are angry. And I don't know if I would say angry, but I would say they don't have enough to do, and they don't have the hope of a good future. And this is across the board, not just in poor communities, that hope is diminishing for our children as higher education gets more expensive, as jobs disappear, and as schools become more repressive and less creative and innovative. When the juvenile court was created back here in Illinois over 100 years ago, the children that went through it had too much to do. They were working in the factories. They were getting in trouble during those few hours when they didn't have anything to do. Now our children don't have enough to do. We as a society are investing, for example, $130 million in 6 juvenile prisons to lock up about 800 kids across the state. That $130 million could do a lot to provide opportunities for our children with job training with after-school programs, and there are no good outcomes coming out of those juvenile prisons as well. More than half of the children will be back in within 3 years. More than half back in the juvenile prison within 3 years. And I think finally that for you all, especially since there are so many judges in the audience, I think this often comes down to a lack of imagination, and I have a complete lack of imagination. Somebody asked me the other day, what do you do as a public defender if you come to the point where you think the judge is going to send the kid to juvenile prison and you don't think the kid should go? And what we really need is an 800 number at that point for judges and for public defenders to call and get somebody to come in and help with a staffing to come up with alternatives. Because as parents, that's what we do, right? As parents, we say, this, I can't remember, I couldn't count how many times I said, that's it. I've reached the end of my rope. That's it. No more. I'm taking that phone away on, whatever it is. And then, of course, we always modify it because you have to keep modifying it until the kid finally reaches 25 and starts really on their way. And so I think that we have to develop more alternatives, and I urge those of you from Cook County to demand that we have Redeploy Illinois for juveniles in Cook County. And the last thing is that you also have out in the front a 2-pager on a report that we just issued on children automatically tried in the adult court in Cook County. For over 30 years since the adoption of these policies, I've been involved in studies tracking the outcomes of these. Again, very poor outcomes, always. 99% of the children are children of color that end up automatically sent to the adult court. Not over 90% plead guilty, and more than half end up pleading to an offense that would not have triggered automatic transfer in the first place. Judges need to make these decisions. And House Bill 4538 in the legislature, Representative Necritz is advocating for judges to make the critical decision of whether a child should be tried in the adult court or not. So I commend that to your attention as well. Finally, as this federal report acknowledges, we stand outside the world community on all of these issues. Trying children in the adult court, shocking to the world community. Life without parole, unheard of. This is particularly specifically banned in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Transfer to adult court, we were just criticized by the UN Committee on Human Rights. We stand outside the world community. Mass incarceration, we stand outside the world community. Solitary confinement, outside the world community. We need to insist that our government follow basic human rights for our citizens, for our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Betsy. Now I'd like to call on Xavier McElrath-Bey.
Okay. I'll leave it this one or this one. Okay. Thank you. Well, it's always hard to be the last one to speak, right? Your heart's pounding, everybody's up there, and
You're actually not last.
well, oh, okay. Well, actually, well, either way, I'm very honored to be on this panel. It's funny, I look out into the audience and I see people who actually played an important role in a lot of the transformations in my life, and it's overwhelming, because it reminds me of places I had been in my life, and more specifically, Elaina, who's out, who's sitting out, who's once sitting up here. She played an important role for me, especially in teaching me. She was my practicum, my internship supervisor at the University of Chicago when I was graduating from Roosevelt. And I remember when I first came in, I had an approach. We're working with kids, and I called that approach the homeboy approach. Very simple, and I just thought rapport and connecting with them would make a big difference. And learning from her, I took my case managing skills to a different level. I learned how to truly assess and diagnose the needs of my clients. And not only that, but also be able to link them with important services. So I'm forever thankful to her for helping me develop in that way. And also Robert Spicer and Cheryl Graves, who actually taught me in the process of peacemaking circles and restorative justice. And so for me, it's truly an honor to be up here and also to share with you. You shared some of my story, but I think that what is often unspoken is strange enough what I heard here today. I feel like Betsy gets it. She understands the challenges that truly exist in the courtroom for our children. But of course, it begins prior to that experience. I grew up in the backyards neighborhood. We talk about childhood traumas, and when I think about the youth that I've worked with in the past 12 years, for the most part, most of my positions were designed to help keep children out of the criminal justice system. But I noticed that even that in of itself was a bit challenging. I mean, it wasn't just because our youth were inclined towards aggressive and negative behavior, but because in some ways I kind of felt like things were stacked up against them already. And it sort of made me reflect upon my life. And prior to my job with the Campaign for Fair Sentencing of Youth, I took on a position as a clinical field interviewer with Northwestern University. And I went out into the community in different parts of the city, Austin, Inglewood, Back of the Yards, Maywood. I had been all over the city, and even out in the outskirts, neighboring states, of kids who were once in a juvenile detention facility here at 1100 South Hamilton. And I came to find there was a lot of commonality there. There was a sort of, a common theme. Strange enough, at the beginning of each clinical interview, I would do a timeline. In that timeline, we would first try to identify early traumatic childhood experiences. We would ask them very, clearly, what were some things that stood out for you? And oftentimes, by the time they got to the age 9 within that timeline, they had already identified 2 or 3 early traumatic childhood experiences. And it made me reflect upon my life as well. My early, looking back, upon my youth, I mean, honestly, first of all, I'm never one to make an excuse for my actions. But looking back, I do recognize that there were certain things that were sort of set up, that really made me go down a certain path in life. First of all, I grew up in a household that had a lot of abuse and a lot of neglect. And I think that had a lot to do also with poverty. The stresses, and we don't talk about that often. I rarely hear people talk about poverty as a risk factor, but it really is. There's no coincidence the majority of the kids that are coming into the juvenile detention facilities here in other states, across our country, are coming from mostly poor and disinvested communities. And of course, that is one of the reasons why there are disproportionately African American and Latinos youth being impacted, but at the same time, there are needs in these communities that we can truly address and make a difference. So for me, growing up in a backyards neighborhood, I remember 2 programs that existed. There was a center on the corner of 51st and Ada, and there was Sherman Park. And I remember these 2 centers used to be overflowing. We used to stand in line, and they had Port Ministries. Port Ministries was a homeless shelter, but they also provided food, clothing, and other basic necessities. And I often frequented that place. And I remember we used to go swim in Cornell Park, and we would run to Port Ministries. We used to stand in line with homeless people. And we used to walk up and we used to grab bread, we used to grab soup. The best days was when they had cake. I remember we would go in there, we'd try to get in front of everybody, And, but I didn't, at the time I didn't realize I was poor in a sense. It's all I had ever seen. But then I also recognized there were things that were going on within my home that, very indicative of how that impacted my life. I remember times when our electricity and gas would be cut off. I remember the urgency my mother would have when that would happen. She would run an extension cord from the living room on across the hallway to our neighbor's apartment, and they would give us energy. I remember times when I would be so embarrassed when some of my friends would come and visit me because, sad to say, there were times when my mother literally put a chain around the refrigerator. And it wasn't because she was trying to starve us. It was because she was trying to help, conserve and portion out our meals so that she can be able to make it to the next batch of government food stamps. And these are things that a lot of people are not aware of. These are things that are unspoken of. And I remember also my mother struggling emotionally. At the time, of course, I was a child. I wasn't familiar with mental, any psychiatric disorders. But I came to find later on my mother had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. And she was also bipolar. My brother also, more severely so, I remember times when I would walk into the bathroom, and he did this often. He would sit in a bathtub, and the water would be up to his chest, and he would watch the bubbles coming up. And I knew, because it was the first time he told me what he was doing, he said he was drowning the spirits. So when you live in an environment that's contending with abuse and neglect, a stepfather that would hesitate at nothing to hit you, your mom, that would hesitate at nothing to kick your dog. Understand, when you grow up in that type of environment and you're learning how to navigate this world as a child with very little assistance and resources and very little intervention, understand it is hard to have a positive youth development. We don't know what's going on in each and every home. In fact, I can bear witness some homes have very stable and loving families, even within some of the most poorest and disinvested communities. But of course, when you step outside that house, what are some of the first things you see? You see gang graffiti. You see the guys hanging out on the block. You see people fighting aggression. I remember I was 9 years old. The first time I saw something truly violent, I was walking past 51st and Elaina, and there was some men fighting in the alley, and I saw a man hit another man in the head with a 2x4. And I remember this man who got hit in the head was so nauseous that he started throwing up. Understand, I was 9 years old at that time. By the time I was 10, 11 years old, I was fully aware of the gang boundaries that surrounded my community. I was fully aware, this is before I even became involved in a gang, that in order for me to get to Hamline Elementary, I had to go down Racine, up to 49th, through the alley, around the school, to the back door to get in. And it's not because I was gang involved. It's because I came from the other side of the tracks. So understand, our children are faced with such adversity and challenges, and we often look to them as if they are, once upon a time, as they were labeled, super predators. As if they have no heart. They were described as godless monsters, children. And I was locked up at that time and era. The sad reality is, on the surface, if you did not look into the needs of the youth, it's so much easier to have that scapegoat, to say it's truly their fault. That these kids don't have a heart, that they're incorrigible. I remember that word was used in the courtroom when I was present, and I didn't even know what that meant. I remember times when I would walk into, and understand, by the time I was 13 years old, I had 19 arrests and 7 convictions. And the very first arrest, I have to say, was because I was poor. The first time I got locked up, I was 9 years old. It's because I went into a grocery store, and I could not resist that candy bar. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't have the money, but I could not resist that candy bar. And so I tried to steal that candy bar, and I got caught. I had tried to shove it up my sleeve. Twice more, I got arrested within months, and that was for trying to take quarters from the parking meter so I can go buy the candy bar. You know, I knew I needed money to get the candy bar. Strange enough, for me, those experiences, I imagine would have been ideal for someone to look into my household, to look into my situation, to really try to assess and recognize the needs that were existing, not just within my own self, but within my family. These were such ideal opportunities. I was not gang involved at that time. But then there was a time when a friend who was a little bit older than me had approached me and said, let's go to 51st and Ada. And when he said that, I didn't know what that meant. And growing up in the back of the yards, being aware of these gang territories, you often try to avoid, being around danger. You know where there's a lot of violence, even as a child. But when I went to that block, I noticed something. I noticed that there was a lot of love and camaraderie. It wasn't just what we hear on the news, the violence and the drugs and the crime. There was a lot of love. And for me, that was so enticing. And why is that? Because the gang was far more advanced than any social institution within my reach in terms of satisfying some of the most basic and fundamental human needs that I had as a child. And that is a very powerful statement, because in reality, I see that every single day on what these kids are going through. I remember I would get locked up on countless occasions, and the judge would give me a week or two in an audio home. And the sense of consequences weren't truly even developed for me at that time. I felt like that was a normal part of my life. That wasn't a consequence. That was a part of my life. And I remember I used to lay in my cell, and first of all, I used to pick the bed up against the wall, stand on top of the bed frame, look out the window, and try to bang for the attention of the people who were walking by. Strange enough, nobody ever heard me. I was like, doom, 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 hey, trying to get some attention. But there were times when I would lay back, and I was just more so focused upon getting back to my neighborhood. And I used to put the radio next to my ear, and I used to close my eyes, and I used to listen to the music that I would listen to when I was in my neighborhood, and I would literally fantasize about being back on my block again. And it's not because I had any ill intentions. It's not because I ever wished to harm anyone. It was more so because I felt like at that time in my life that they were the only ones who truly cared. I was a child. We talk about the development of a child's brain and how a child's brain is very much different from adults. The truth of the matter, this is something that most parents are aware of, that early on, the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed. And what do we know about the prefrontal cortex? That it involves the weighing of consequences. It involves impulse control. And because that's not fully developed as an adolescent, we are more inclined towards the sort of developmentally primitive parts of the brain, which are the amygdala. And unfortunately, that is more given to the emotional context of the situation, meaning that if I'm in a situation where I have to make a decision as a child, I am physically inclined, it's already scripted in my brain to act based upon the emotional context of a situation. So if I feel peer pressure, if I feel my friends want me to do this, and they are my primary group, and we know this, that when you're a child, that your primary group are your youth, you are gonna do what you think is expected of you in regards to their expectations. And it's really just a feedback system. If you take those same children, you separate them, you take them on an individual conversation, you come to discover that in fact, they have good hearts. They just can't overcome that peer pressure. They cannot overcome that desire. They don't know how to address that unfulfilled need. And they certainly are not aware of the developmental pitfalls that exist in adolescence. So for me, after 19 arrests and 7 convictions, being gang involved, even after having been shot in my face at point blank range, even after having almost died at the age of 11 years old, that still was not enough to deter me. And because I was still driven for the rewards of love and acceptance. But by the time I was 13, standing in front of a judge, and they had to make a decision of whether or not to charge me as an adult, much like we've been talking about here today, I was not old enough to be automatically transferred. It was a discretionary decision. And they looked at my background. My probation officer fought hard to get me transferred into the adult criminal system. And I think that was mostly because one day he came to my house to see if I was in school, and I was not in school. And I remember him saying, "Grab your jacket, you're going to the Audi home." And I said, "Okay, I'll be right back," and I went out the back door, you know. He was mad about that, so he held that against me, and he looked at me and said, "You know what, you're going to the adult criminal justice system." And at that time, unfortunately, you know, I didn't really understand what that meant. But I remember soon after I went into the adult criminal justice system, my very first court appearance, which was no longer within the realm of the juvenile court, they came to my cell. They brought me down to the bullpen downstairs. I noticed there was a lot of spit and feces all over the wall. And so I didn't even want to sit down on the cement platform that they had created for us to sit on. And I was standing there, and I remember them coming, and I heard chains jingling in the hall. And I remember coming and opening it up, and for the first time in my life I had ever experienced, they put shackles around my wrists. And I remember clearly them saying, "These are too big." And the craziest part about it, the guy said, "Those are the smallest ones that we have." I hate when this happens.
Take your time. So when I went into the adult court, I remember they had separate bullpens. They had some for the adults and some for the youth, for the kids, but they were actually, it was pretty much built the same. And so we used to always hear the older guys, "Yeah, yo, what are you doing here?" You know, they used to look at us. It was like a joke to them. Even to the adults who were locked up used to look at us, and they were baffled to see how small in stature and how youthful we were to be standing in front of the same judges, facing the very same consequences. But I also remember, strange enough, I remember the very first time I got a visit
When I got locked up, in the day, some of you have been in an audio home, thank you. In the day room, they have these soft seats. They have we call them soft seats. Not everybody had a chance to get in the seat and sit in the soft seat. The back row was all hard, so I had the privilege this day, and I was lucky enough to get a soft seat. And I remember sitting right in front of the television, and I remember one of the staff saying, "Xavier, you got a visit." And I looked up, and I didn't see nobody. I didn't see anybody. It was a small partition that was slightly above my head, and I was looking up. I didn't see anyone. It wasn't visit day. And I remember walking behind the glass, and I looked, and there was a short black woman that was standing there waiting for me. She had a handful of papers. And I remember walking up, and when I went to the front foyer, usually when we have a visitor, we'll sit in the main side, but they had asked that we sit more towards the back room. Thank you. More towards the back is obviously was intended to be a very personal conversation, a very private conversation. Little did I know, it was my public defender. And I remember when I first spoke with her, it wasn't nothing like what I had experienced with my previous public defender, who was more so concerned at that time with the details of the case. Don't get me wrong, she asked about the details of the case and gave me a sense of what would be happening from this point forward, but she was asking questions about my life. She was trying to understand what led me there. How did I get there? She asked me very personal questions about where I grew up. Do I have family support? Do I have people who are there for me? And I remember I used to stand in the courtroom, and there were times when I felt like, I don't know, what is this little woman going to do for me? These people are, first of all, I was in a courtroom, and the judge was sitting so high, and I used to always remember looking up right at him. And I remember we used to be there, and they would be talking in a language I did not understand. And they would say these things, and I remember it was like a routine. I would listen to my public defender, I would listen to the state's attorney speak, and then I would listen to the judge, and then I would go to my public defender and say, "What are you saying?" Because I didn't understand. I used to have to wait until I went into the bullpen to get a full understanding of what was happening. And I think this was common. I remember we used to always go back to the bullpen and like, "Man, what happened?" Like, "I don't know." We used to pace. We used to act like, "I don't know what's going on." But when it came, our public defenders would explain to us more clearly exactly what had taken place. And more often than not, it was just a continuance. But as time went by in my case, unfortunately, another youth who was who was also a co-defendant, who was 14 at the time. At the time when I got locked up for the murder, I was 13 years old, but my co-defendant was 14. He was just 1 year older than me. And there was also 3 adults on my case. And the 3 adults, as you can imagine, played a more dominant role in the offense. And of course, us, as youth, we never think about killing someone. You don't go into a situation and say, "Yeah, I'm going to kill someone." This is something that we found ourselves in because of that affiliation, that association, and that inability to rise above given situations. We found ourselves living up to the expectations and going straight into that destruction and standing in front of that very same judge. And I remember they were going back and forth discussing time. There was so much stacked against me. There were witnesses. There was a statement. I had been convinced to make a statement because everyone else made a statement. And of course, as a child, you don't know your laws. These things were not fully explained. A parent was not present. A lawyer was not present at the time of interrogation. So many things led me to that place where I knew for a fact that I was going to get time. And my co-defendant was given 40 years, who was 14 years old. And the only reason why I knew he was guilty wasn't because I heard from his mouth directly, but I remember sitting by the glass in the audio home looking out my room, because my room was directly across from when the kids would walk by, and they always used the main elevator. And when he went to trial, I had came back, and I sat there in my room, and I just waited intently, and I saw him walk in. It was around 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, and when he had walked past our section, he was in tears. And it was then that my heart dropped, and I knew that I was going to get time also. And it wasn't like I was going to be locked up until I was 21. I was facing 60 years in prison. I played a more dominant role than he did. He only had 1 conviction. I had 19 arrests and 7 convictions. I was guaranteed to face 40, if not more, years in prison. And I remember my public defender who stood there and defended me, her telling me, saying, "Xavier, you have options here. You do have options." And I remember her fighting and going in there, and she said, "Xavier, I'm going to fight for you. I'm going to go into this conference room, and I'm going to try to come out with the best deal possible. I don't want to make any promises to you." And I said, do whatever you can do. 40 years is a lot of years, So she went into that conference room, and I remember it took about 2.5, 3 hours, and I was pacing back and forth. I was sweating. I was scared to death. I didn't know what to expect. I was facing 40. My public defender said, I'm going to try to get you 30, and the least you can get is 20. But for me, obviously, that was unimaginable. I was, in their eyes, incorrigible. So when she went into that conference room, she fought to bring it down. But when she came out, strange enough, when she came out, my fears were only magnified because I noticed that she was crying. My public defender was in tears. Her eyes were red. And you could tell that she had been in there going through something that I could only imagine, perhaps not even solely on a professional level, but speaking from her heart. And she came to me and she said, Xavier, I'm sorry. And I said, what? She said, they were only able to give a 25-year sentence. And I thought to myself, like, wait a minute, you say you're going to try to get 30. And obviously, she was trying to get the minimum. She didn't want my hopes to go up too high. But in fact, in reality, she never really wanted me to serve any of those sentences, and it still hurted her to have to work out that deal. And if it wasn't for her, I would not have gotten out in 13 years. I would have gotten out in perhaps 20 and 30 years. And I want you all to give her a hand of applause. She's actually standing in this room. Ms. Herschella Connors, where are you? Where are you? Well, she's probably hiding. Ms. Herschella Conyers, who helped organize this event, actually played a crucial role in my outcome in life. And it's truly an honor. And I want to encourage all public defenders and probation officers never to give up on a child. There's no such thing as a bad child. Thank you. There she is, y'all. She's running. It's coming.
That's a very tough act to follow, I realize, but we have Mr. Daryle Brown, who certainly has some very important words to share with us. Mr. Brown.
While I get I feel like I'm cheating that I have a presentation after that brother's discussion there. So I'm not going to try to compete with that. I mean, that was thank you very much for your story. That was outstanding. I appreciate that a lot. So first, I'll apologize for coming in a little late. I had the wrong time mentally, had the right time in my phone and the wrong time mentally. So I'm glad to be here. I think they had the original lineup correct. Xavier should have been batting cleanup, and I would have got my little single to get on base, and he could have brought us all in. But as it may be, I still have a bit of conversation. I'll tell you, my name is Daryle Brown. I'm I'm the lead organizer for a group called the Next Movement, which is a committee of the prison ministry at Trinity United Church of Christ. We formed shortly after a visit. We had Michelle Alexander at the church in December 2010 to talk about her, at the time, new book, The New Jim Crow. We had a convening about, she came in on a Sunday. That next Saturday, we had a convening. We had about 100 people from different organizations and institutions around Chicago to talk about what do we do now. Michelle had laid out so well the issue of mass incarceration and some of the causes, and as people of conscience, what do we do? What do we do now that we know that there's a systemic issue out there that has huge challenges? How do we address this? How do we focus on that? And we formed this group, the Next Movement. We've been primarily focused on growing awareness. Part of the issue is to build enough of a grassroots organization or enough substance in the grassroots to affect the kind of change. I mean, because The system of mass incarceration is wicked and cruel and massive and financially viable for many different institutions and organizations and corporations. The prison industrial complex is second only to our military industrial complex in America, with $1 trillion over the last 40 years spent to execute a drug war that I think we'll all recognize that has been totally ineffective in meeting any of the goals that were perhaps projected, unless massive incarceration of black and brown and poor and disadvantaged people was the goal. In that case, it's been very successful. I have a few slides that I want to focus on that just talk about education, for one. And we see often that education funding is kind of the issue. And folks will tell us that in America, we spend more to educate our kids than anybody else in the world. Substantially more in some instances, not that substantially more in others, and that we don't get what we pay for. We're number one in spending per child, but depending on the particular metric, whether it's math or science or some others, we're not number one in achieving those successful outcomes. But what a couple of the slides and a little bit of the research I did will indicate is that they're good. They want to convince us of that. And I don't want to ascribe ulterior motives necessarily. But we look at it from such a macro level that it's easy to say we're spending $7,000 some odd dollars per student across the United States, and that's the largest number. But we all know that we have many school districts. We have 50 states. We have hundreds of school districts within each state, and that number can vary from $15,000 a student to $5,000 a student, depending on where you are. And certainly, if you look at some of our own schools, thank you. Okay, so I've just used that to move through. Okay, this is my mic. Okay, so I need to stay near the mic, stay near the keyboard. I've given you the overview. I'm going to hit up just real quickly a little more about us. Okay, so our vision is that the U.S. justice system is inhumane and immoral and can only be changed through the efforts of everyday people passionately working to educate, inform their communities. Core to our success is the conviction that America is committing an incredible injustice on entire populations of its own citizens, and that brought to light, average Americans will become allies in the fight for justice and human rights. So, I mean, our overall vision is that if people know better, they do better. So our effort, like I mentioned, was really primarily on awareness and education. There will be a time when we have very tight strategies that we'll be implementing, different types of advocacy things. I like to talk about a story by Saul Alinsky. He gets the attribution for it. It could have been someone else that came up with it. You're on a riverbank, everybody's enjoying themselves, barbecue, dominoes, bid whist for those bid whist players, everybody's having a good time, and a cry comes up that there's a child in the river. Everybody, rush out to the river, bring the child ashore, resuscitate, comfort the child, then a cry goes up again, there's another child in the river. The scenario repeats itself over and over. Pretty soon the whole riverbank is a conundrum of people working to rescue, resuscitate, take care of, comfort these children. And we use that as our kind of our touch point. There are many wonderful institutions out there right now that are taking care of the after effect of the mass incarceration situation. folks that are doing things for, it could be anything from anger management to counseling to housing to job preparedness. There are lots, hundreds, thousands. There's a whole institutional operation employing hundreds of thousands of people. But our job is to go upstream and stop people from throwing people in the river in the first place. And that's the kind of the way we see our mission. So we're looking to be a little more strategic, a little more advocacy-based, and we're looking in the long term to put all those operations out of business. I had an opportunity to meet with Ruth Wilson Gilmore. She's an author, founder of Critical Resistance, and at that time, I was just really cutting my teeth on this whole issue, and I was convinced really that the drug war, if we could end the drug war, that's going to get us halfway to ending this mass incarceration crisis. And Ruth's challenge to me was, well, what about the other half? You go from, at that point, 2.4 million people in prison to 1.2 million people in prison. It's still 4 times the 300,000 people that were in prison in as late as, I guess, the 70s, early 80s. So how do you beat down the rest of it? And over time, I guess I've become more of a prison abolitionist than a prison reformist. Because I think that in the end, given a working salary, enough jobs for people to not have to resort to crime, given the end of the drug war, given return to real public mental health, we won't have the need for many prisons because people don't want to be criminals. People are pushed into criminality by their environment. It's not a racially driven thing. Given holding steady factors such as education and other things, you find that people of all races kind of react the same way, given a certain scenario. So I kind of talked about the incarceration epidemic. How did it start? Richard Nixon and his war on drugs probably is the beginning of it, but arguably that was more a philosophical idea that was bastardized by politicians following Nixon. Because if you look at Nixon's original war on drugs, over 60% of the funding of his war on drugs was for drug treatment programs. And that's something that, we kind of miss when we think about that. But what happened as a result of that was that all of a sudden, politicians latched on to the idea of the war on drugs, and they started laying on all types of other layers, whether they be 3 strikes laws, the real tough on crime legislatures that are out there. Many of the laws enacted by Bill Clinton, who's supposed to be, we tend to think of Bill Clinton very fondly in the black community until you dig into the depth of some of the programs that he supported and implemented that were very, very damaging to the black community, including a lot of these anti-reintegration laws, the types of things that keep former felons from being able to live in public housing and things like that, that are just ultimately very damaging. Certainly newer to us is, and I'm accused by a lot of my friends as being an Obama apologist because I tend to think that in the end, he has our interests at heart, even if he can't quite do everything that we'd like for him to do to help us. But I have no defense for the way that he's implemented the detention policies on the Latino community. I think that's a mistake, but that's another driver of the incarceration rate. As a matter of fact, those numbers don't even show up in our incarceration statistics. All those people out in Maywood that are in detention, they don't show up in the statistics. So while we make note that incarceration rates are dropping, I would argue they're probably really not. They're just disguised a little bit. So Just a quick chart that just shows a little bit about where the war on drugs kind of started, how the incarceration rate skyrocketed, and how it had little or no effect on the trending of violent crime or property crime. So whatever we've done with it, it hasn't really helped. This is a little wordy. I'm going to blow through that. The war on drugs, I think we've covered enough. And get into what about the children. So one of the questions I asked myself was, does higher spending on education mean better education? And of course, the experts will say, no. You look at the United States, we're spending a whole lot of money educating our children. Now, this isn't necessarily proportional to population, but it just says we spend a lot of money on education. Then this chart says, well, what about the impacts of all that money? $7,700 about per student compared to the rest of the world, over $2,000, well, just about $2,000 more than the UK. And then the results, math test scores, we're third from the bottom. Literacy rate, we do okay, but mostly everybody up there is around 99%. Science test scores, again, kind of low. So you might argue that we're not getting what we pay for. I think in some instances that may be true, but I also think that if our true objective was to optimize the education of every student, we would have to fund schools better in some places, like Chicago. They also talk about education quality and spending having little correlation. And this kind of supports that, but not really. Some places spend a lot of money to get great education. Some places spend, like Utah spends little or no money compared to everybody else and puts them in the middle of the pack. But if you look at it on a micro level, if you look at it more school to school and relational in terms of like Illinois, where I'm sure the top districts spend 15 grand or so per student, and the lower spending districts are probably a third of that. This is some interesting research that kind of refutes the vast majority of what I could find. Really just talked about the macro level charts that I showed earlier. But then you have these more focused reports that are a little bit more buried, like the one at the Princeton Center that says if you spend an extra $1,000 on education, it's associated with 3.44% reduction in low scores on math. So, I mean, there is a place for better funding and better education. The MIT Harvard study that says once we adjust for labor market factors, we estimate that raising teacher wages by 10% reduces high school dropout rates by 3% to 4%. So, I mean, there are correlations between spending and quality education. Of course, you do have to pay attention and spend the money in a good place. Now, just to shift gears slightly, to talk specifically about Chicago schools and the prison pipeline. These AMP schools, basically schools that have autonomous management and performance. You can think of it as charter schools or even some contract schools that have more ability to affect the overall curriculum of their schools. And the percentage of African American students that attend them. So you see that the schools that are on probation is where the vast majority of African American students are. It's a tragedy. It is, in effect, the throwaway schools. I happen to do restorative justice work and peace circles at a school that is definitely among these that are challenged. And it appears to me that some problems can be anticipated, and they aren't. And so then we rush in with resources at the end to try to recover, and it just doesn't work. And I'm afraid this is going to be listed as a failing school in the future. And the criminalization that begins in school for so many of our kids. Again, the African Americans, 3,240 students were arrested in the schools in this year. I think this was 2012. Or 76% of all the arrests, when they represent 43% of the students. With a show of hands, who knew that Hispanic students was the largest percentage of students in Chicago schools? I didn't know that. I learned that just now, or just as I was researching a bit for this conversation. But even though they only represent 21% of those that are arrested. And a lot of that is, I get it. I understand how teachers can be frustrated with dealing with these very, very challenging students. But to criminalize them is not doing society any good. There are better options. There are better ways. And I hate to think that it's as simple as this. You know, keep reducing the funds in the schools and just drive fodder for the prison industrial complex. So how do we turn this around? Well, I got a couple ideas. Certainly there are more equitable funding. I mean, we need to fix the funding in Illinois for our schools. We certainly have schools in Chicago that are destitute. You know, schools that don't have books. How in the world you teach kids without them having the correct books, I have no idea. Proactive work at reducing the criminalization of our children in the school environment. You know, we need to figure out better ways, and I think the earlier speaker talked about the low percentage of the real significant crimes that our kids are being criminalized about, and certainly that translates into the school. I mean, in the school, kids can get criminalized for things as minor as talking back, you know, consistently to the teacher. You know, and I have a very good friend that spent about a little more than 18 years. He would say 18 years, 26 days, and 18 minutes in a federal prison for a drug conspiracy thing. And he explained to me how throughout your life you accumulate points based on, you know, your arrests or convictions and things like that, and how that comes into play with the formula later on in life when you do something for how much time you get. So the criminalization of our children is lining them up, putting them in the funnel for them to be pumped right into the pipeline to prison. And then last idea or concept is that we need to fully implement restorative justice, restorative practices. I mean, they're already part of the guidelines, the CPS. But you know how often you have guidelines for things that you don't fully fund. So there you are. Uh-oh, I hit a wrong button. Okay, I'm good. So restorative justice, just going quickly, it provides a space for healing and the rebuilding of a sense of community when wrongs are done. It emphasizes the harm caused and repairing that harm that's revealed by unjust behavior or actions, bullying, things like that. And it involves everybody. It involves the perpetrator, it involves the victim, and it involves the community or the school. The practices that we talk about are peace circles, peer juries, victim offender conferencing, and community service, as well as restorative conversations. And they have measurable outcomes. I mean, this is not pie in the sky stuff. A lot of, like peace circles, they've been going on for thousands of years. This is not new stuff. It's how communities resolve their challenging issues for thousands of years, from the Indians to African tribes, ancient solutions to community issues when they didn't have jails. They didn't have no place to lock you up. So they had to figure out how to bring you back into community. And of course, we have plenty of jails. We've forgotten all about the idea of bringing people back into community. So, I mean, it has measurable outcomes that have been proven to be effective, and I would encourage all of us to really stand behind that. So just as comparison, the current system of justice versus restorative. What laws were broken? What happened is the restorative question. What laws were broken is the Western, our typical justice system question. Who did it? What punishment do they deserve? That's the questions we ask in our justice system. Whereas in a restorative process, we ask what happened, who was hurt, what are the needs to rectify the situation, and whose obligation is it? So quite different circumstances to provide that. So in summary, for us, mass incarceration is the major human rights issue of our time. It's destroying our families and our own potential. It represents an incredible waste of, resources, both human resources and material. Increasingly, it's starting in our schools with the pipeline effect, moving our children from school to prison. And we need new paradigms. I'll leave you with a quote from Martin Luther King that I don't think gets enough play. I mean, we like to look at Martin Luther King in an idealized way and forget the fact that he was a realist. And he said, what is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. And justice at its best is love, correcting everything that stands against love. So I'll leave you with that. I appreciate this opportunity to come and speak to you. Thank you.